collaborators in Turkey. And he has several publications in Turkish, most recently a special issue on spatial justice and earthquakes. This is something that he edited last summer, and a collection of essays that was published as a book titled İklimin Estetiği, Climate Aesthetics, published in 2020. Our next speaker will be Hazal Hürman. Hazal Hürman is a PhD candidate in the Department of Anthropology and the Interdisciplinary Program in the Humanities at Princeton University. Hazal is currently conducting her ethnographic research in the Antep region for her dissertation project on experiences and self-representations of children of different backgrounds to understand reconfigurations of ethno-racial belongings and political subjectivities in contemporary Turkey. Next, we have Dr. Hişyar Özsoy. He's a social anthropologist by training. He received his PhD from UT Austin in 2010, and after that he worked from 2011 to 2015 as an assistant professor of cultural anthropology at the University of Michigan, Flint. And then he took a, well, shall we say, detour. I don't know if it's temporary or not, when he was elected to the Turkish parliament, representing on the HDP ticket, HDP, People's Democratic Party. That was in 2015. Since February 2016, he has been serving as deputy chair of HDP, responsible for foreign affairs. He has been a Diyarbakir deputy since June 2018, and simultaneously a member of the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe. That, yeah, if anything requires an acronym, that's it, and it's an easy one, PACE. And Interparliamentary Union, the NATO Parliamentary Assembly, and the Parliamentary Assembly of the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. Next, we have Dr. Murat Güney, who is a social scientist and an urban researcher. Murat Güney received his PhD from Columbia University. His research interests include urban resilience, earthquakes, urban transformation, housing problems, wealth and income inequality. In his most recent research paper, Earthquake, Disaster Capitalism, and Massive Urban Transformation in Istanbul, published in the Geographical Journal, he shows how the shock of the 1999 Marmara earthquake was effectively used by the neoliberal market and government as a shock therapy to implement a construction-led development model for Turkey. He is also the co-editor of Massive Suburbanization, Rebuilding the Global Periphery, which was published by University of Toronto Press in 2019. And he also has 2 edited volumes in Turkish, Başka Dünyalar Mümkün, Other Worlds Are Possible, published in 2007, and Türkiye'de iktidarı yeniden düşünmek, Rethinking Power Relations in Turkey, published in 2009. And also he edits the political and cultural criticism journal Davetsiz Misafir, the uninvited guest. As I already stated, our moderators are also our Keyman postdoctoral fellows. And first we have Dr. Anoush Suni. She is a social anthropologist, lots of anthropologists today. She earned her PhD from the University of California, Los Angeles in 2019. Her research interests include state and intercommunal violence, memory, materiality and landscape, cultural heritage, space and place, and political and historical anthropology in Turkey, Armenia, Kurdistan, and the broader Middle East. She's currently working on a manuscript project based on her dissertation, Palimpsest of Violence, Renation and the Politics of Memory in Anatolia, which investigates questions of memory and the material legacies of state violence in the region of Van on the historic Armenian and contemporary Kurdish communities. Finally, Dr. Ekin Kurtiç received her PhD from Harvard University in 2019. She is a socio-cultural anthropologist, and her research is at the intersection of environmental humanities, social studies of infrastructure, and technopolitics and political ecology. She's working on her first book manuscript currently, Sedimented Landscape, Building Dams, Restoring Ecologies in the Çoruh Basin, which critically examines state-led projects of restoring and salvaging nature in the process of large dam building in Turkey. So I'm going to now leave the floor to our first speaker, and I think he also has a brief announcement before starting. Please, Eray.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Ipek, and thank you very much to Anoush and Ekin as well for bringing us together, and to Alison too for helping us have a smooth running event. And many thanks to my fellow panelists as well for being here. So I really cherish this opportunity for collective reflection, an opportunity that I haven't really had the chance over the past 5 weeks to have, as I focused on helping the relief efforts from distance. And I wanted to begin by mentioning this fundraiser organized by a journal that I'm the editor of. And we've got artworks and books for sale, and proceeds will go to non-governmental organizations prioritizing the disproportionately affected. And I suppose the link is now shared in the chat box. So do see if you want to contribute by purchasing one of the wonderful works we've got on offer, or by simply spreading the word. Okay, so I'm a scholar who works on Turkey's histories of state violence and their material spatial legacies. And these legacies now sadly include the disaster we've been seeing since February 6th. Contextualizing this disaster in this particular way within these kind of material spatial legacies of violence obliges us to focus it on deep-seated injustices and struggles for justice that they've been met with. And this is precisely the focus of the special issue that I guest edited in Turkish on the theme of spatial justice and earthquakes last May. The invitation came from the Center for Spatial Justice, an Istanbul-based independent research organization, and their in-house publications team, and especially editor-in-chief Bahar Bayhan, offered great input and support. And this special issue pushes against the limits of the mantra that all disasters are political. So as I argue in my introduction to the special issue, the idea that disasters are political is no longer an inherently radical one. And it's now the stuff of disaster risk and resilience policies in the modern liberal mode. After all, in Turkey, for example, since 2012, we've had a law called the disaster law that promises to disaster-proof the country. And since 2009, we've had AFAD, a spatial state agency, a special state agency that is dedicated to disaster and emergency management. The state's National Earthquake Strategy and Action Plan for 2023, which was finalized in 2013, avowedly aims, and I quote, to create a society that's resilient to and prepared for earthquake risk, and uses participatory methods that engage multiple social actors. So these emphases on society and participation demonstrate that now the state itself approaches earthquakes as decisively social and political. The question then becomes exactly where the social and political character of disasters is constituted. And this question must, I suggest, be addressed in as context-specific a way as possible. By context specificity, I mean both the specific practical context of disaster preparedness and the specific histories framing the context in which disasters are prepared for. Obviously, in our case, that's Turkey. So rather than saying, as some critics have done, that Turkey has no disaster preparedness policies in place, or that the urban renewal programs pursued under the disaster law are simply the latest phase in Turkey's integration into the neoliberal global rentier economy, we must take seriously the disaster law as an instrument of doing politics and shaping society in a specific way, that is, in specific places, on the back of specific histories, and in favor of or against specific constituencies. You could consider, for example, the current iteration of the disaster law, which includes an amendment passed in April 2016. In the context of a violent counterinsurgency campaign the state was then conducting in Kurdish towns and cities, the government amended the disaster law to be able to use it for what they called the reconstruction of urban theaters of war, or what I'd call the displacement of residents. The disaster law's original iteration had actually avoided defining what disaster entails. But this amendment now introduced a new clause to the effect of such a definition. Disaster risk areas could now be declared, and I quote, where public order and security have been disturbed to the extent of interrupting ordinary life, end of quote. When the fighting subsided, the government began to use this clause for designating racialized neighborhoods as disaster risk areas, including those in Turkey's Kurdistan, which had not seen war, or even those elsewhere in Turkey, for example, in Istanbul. So again, it's not that there are no disaster preparedness policies in place, but the policies that are in place treat disaster preparedness as a national security imperative that marks racialized communities as threats to this national security. And in this context where national security and disaster preparedness sort of overlap, the ways of life and livelihoods of communities are themselves marked as disaster. Therefore, the question is not simply a local case study of how neoliberal capitalism or the rentier economy operates through the construction sector, etc. And we could give numerous examples where there is no drive whatsoever for rent, and still the state seeks to wield the disaster law. The question then becomes context-specific histories of violence that condition the established political order and that racialize certain communities as threats to national security. Now, here one could mention also actually the origins of not just this amendment that was passed in April 2016, but also the original iteration of the disaster law, whose emphasis on urban renewal builds on what one might call a legislative precedent from 2005, which was the so-called law for the protection of dilapidated historical and cultural real estate through renewal. While my limited time would prohibit a detailed discussion, suffice it to say that this law from 2005 was implemented in urban areas like Istanbul's Sulukule and Tarlabaşı, then inhabited again by racialized communities such as the Roma or Kurds, who had fled various kinds of precarity and insecurity by moving into and repurposing those buildings that the law now deemed dilapidated. And you could call this something of an architectural counterpart to the environmental politics of decay and repair that I know Ekin has worked on. Of course, the adjective dilapidated that is used here obfuscates the fact that these buildings were once inhabited by non-Muslims, but emptied out as a result of violent policies like the Armenian genocide, which obviously Anoush has worked on in the case of Van, and subsequently the wealth tax or the anti-non-Muslim pogroms that picked up from where the genocide left off, something that IPEC has worked on. What's important for our discussion is that this experience in the late 2000s of precisely where and against whom to conduct urban renewal then informed the making of the disaster law in the early 2010s. Following the recent earthquakes that we've seen, it's this national security inflected approach to disaster preparedness that has exacerbated already existing injustices. The worst hit areas are not only home to a significant Alevi and Kurdish population, but also epicenters of state-endorsed racialized violence. You know, the question of where the earthquake has had the worst effects, for example, cannot be considered independently of places central to the history of the Armenian genocide, you know, ranging from Musadag in Antakya to Zeytun in Marash. Neither is the question independent of late 1960s and 1970s anti-Alevi massacres and pogroms that took place in the very places that are now among the worst hit, such as Malatya, Elbistan, and central Marash, or the fact that many of the victims of police violence during Gezi Park protests were from Antakya, not to mention the connection to the war in Kurdistan in the mid-2010s that I've already discussed. So it's due exactly to these kinds of historical connections that the fallout from the earthquake has been taking place the way it has. Again, an example is the Alevi town of Pazarcık in Marash, where the state has expropriated the aid collected by Alevi Kurdish organizations. There is no drive for rent here, right? There's little drive for rent in Pazarcık. But there's a drive for a national security reflex that dovetails with decades of state-endorsed and racialized violence, whose epicenters include exactly this region. Examples abound, rubble being dumped in Kurdish Alevi villages, fields farmed by landless peasants in Adıyaman being expropriated for emergency housing under a new law, widowed women and orphaned children rescued from under the rubble going missing, as they are suspected to have been abducted by sex trafficking and organ trafficking gangs that allegedly involve members of the police and the armed forces, just to name a few examples. So conclude, state-endorsed violence has time and again attempted to racialize and objectify communities into subjugation as an exploitable resource for cheap labor or sometimes for touristic entertainment. Communities who have survived these attempts have done so by self-organizing, and in turn, the establishment has marked these forms of organizing as a disaster to be prevented. I'll end by saying that we must focus our understanding of what makes disasters political on the context-specific tensions between these practices of inflicting injustice and struggling for justice. Thank you.
Thank you, Eray, for your presentation. And next we have Hazal. Hazal, you have the...
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, everyone joining, and also to the organizers for creating this opportunity for us to think about, reflect on, and share our experiences of the ongoing disaster in Turkey and Syria, and also for the organizers' heartfelt solidarity over the last month. So I want to thank you. Just to give a background to my reflections today. The earthquakes caught me in the middle of my ethnographic dissertation research in Gaziantep, right by the epicenter. Like many, I threw myself out of the building with the first quake, assuming that my apartment somehow survived, but I will face a destroyed city. To our astonishment, this was not the case, as the city center of Antep is relatively standing still in comparison to the rest of the affected cities. On the other hand, two large districts of Antep, approximately 40 kilometers away from the city center, Nurdu and Islahiye, are among the areas hit hardest, being totally demolished. Even as the city center Antep is relatively unharmed in terms of the number of collapsed buildings immediately by the earthquake, together with the demolished Islahiye and Nurdu, it is a site of humanitarian and political crisis today. And the astonishment of having survived, many of us experienced during the first couple of hours following the earthquake, is soon replaced by anger, and only anger, even surpassing the fear and the grief in the midst of the political disaster. I've been joining relief efforts implemented by diverse local organizations in Islahiye and Nurdu, as well as the city center Antep. And over the last month, I have also been in the Hatay region, which was hit hardest together with Marash. Being part of small local efforts to compensate for the lack of state support, my days so far have been filled by searching for tent manufacturers, trying to find the ways to deliver those tents to those in need before diverse state agencies seize them, packing boxes of dry food and hygiene kits, and visiting temporary sheltering areas to write reports about human rights abuses. So what I will share today will be in the form of rather raw observations from the field, rather than more macro level conceptual reflections as to the nature of political and natural disaster. With that, I hope I can provide a description, albeit limited, of how the crisis and the broader categories we think with in social sciences are being experienced by diverse groups in the earthquake-affected areas, and increasingly becoming convinced of the importance of archiving the intricate ways in which disaster capitalism reproduces itself while simultaneously exacerbating ethno-racial hierarchies. My attempt will be to discuss briefly how the politics of disaster unfolds in the aftermath of earthquake in Antep. And also actually following Dr. Çaylı's comments, one thing I should say based on my observation on different sites of Antep and Hatay is that it is almost impossible, especially in this crisis moment, to make generalizations about the needs and issues in the earthquake affected areas, let alone the regional differences, such as the one between relatively conservative pro-government city of Maraş and Antakya of religious minorities. The needs and tensions within a city or even a district are diverse. On top of this, differences in demographic composition affected cities are also accompanied by different forms of disaster response from the side of the state. In the city center, Antep, the most affected area in terms of the physical damage is called İbrahimli, which to date actually has been considered to be the modern, fancy, upper-class residential area of the city center. In contrast to relatively older structuring of the city built on a rocky terrain, İbrahimli has been open to construction in recent years by drying up the marsh areas. Today, İbrahimli is a ghostly neighborhood, as many who used to live there had the means to flee to either surrounding cities or village houses they own themselves. But even though most buildings collapse are located in İbrahimli, a number of buildings located in the neighborhoods that are not demolished as much are also reported to be moderately and severely damaged. Initially, the plan declared by the Ministry of Environment and Urban Planning was that those moderately damaged buildings were to be reinforced, but the recent official statement suggests that they will be demolished together with those severely damaged. In the long run, this will introduce a larger number of households into reconstruction efforts while putting them into debt to the state. In the short run, one immediate problem facing those living in the city center, Antep, is the lack of temporary sheltering. On top of this, of course, there is the distrust toward the official damage assessment reports, as some landlords are trying to change the assessment reports for their damaged buildings from moderate to mildly damaged so that their estate does not lose market value. And unfortunately, we have been hearing the local authorities and municipalities have somewhat been cooperative in this respect with the landowners in changing the damage assessment reports of the buildings from moderately damaged to mildly damaged. The relatively minor physical harm visible to eye in the city center is also instrumentalized by the local authorities to neglect the popular demand for temporary sheltering. There are only 3 relatively symbolic state-sponsored tent areas in the city center, accommodating approximately 2,000 people in a city center of approximately 2 million people. With a logic that I can only describe as out of sight, out of mind, local authorities are employing a discourse of immediate return to normal, dislocating those staying in tents from the urban spaces. This no-tent policy proves, of course, hardest for those who do not have the means to flee the city center, but have been living in the houses that are moderately and severely damaged and to be demolished. In the majority Kurdish upper hills of Antep, many families are forced into damaged buildings for not having access to temporary sheltering areas, making ongoing aftershocks even more riskier for many. In the neighborhoods populated largely by Syrian refugees and or Roma and Dom population, people do not even have mostly access to official damage assessments, as they are not the landowners and they cannot really communicate with their landowners anymore. We have seen several times that these groups being harassed by local security officials, requesting them to remove the tents they built in the city center. Many times, those refusing to return to their damaged houses are pushed towards the outskirts of the city with no access to electricity, water, or sanitation. And following the logic of out of sight, out of mind, local authorities in one-to-one conversations stress how much state-level visitors Antep is receiving nowadays, and complain how the visibility of such populations at the city center harm the image of the city. The same officials also shared the opinion that the refugees, Roma and Dom populations are not earthquake victims, but are just poor of the city who have always been in need. This logic defines the living conditions of the earthquake survivors in largely or worstly destroyed Islahiye and Nurdağı. In one of our visits to the temporary sheltering area in Nurdağı with a local NGO providing humanitarian help, for instance, the authorities welcomed the volunteers of the NGO saying, quote, "This place is just for you, fit for your work. The only problem is that there are no earthquake victims," unquote. Those non-victim victims staying in the tents are Roma and Dom populations who have been historically living in the district and also lost their houses. But to the authorities, they just like living in the tents and it's just part of their culture. Likewise, among the two temporary sheltering areas composed of tents in Islahiye, one is designed only for locals, not letting Syrian refugees in. The other mixed sheltering complex, on the other hand, is also prone to tension. All the tents in the area are marked by number 1 or 2, number 1s belonging to Turkish citizens and number 2s to Syrian refugees. The lines for receiving food are also distinct for Turkish citizens and Syrian refugees. And many women and children refrain from even trying to benefit from psychosocial services provided in the area with the fears of maltreatment. Confirming their worries, the service providers in the temporary sheltering areas tend to treat especially the minority youth as potential criminals. On top of this, the Syrians are being told that they all will be dislocated to another temporary sheltering area in Nizip at the other edge of the city. Having lived for more than 10 years in these districts, they now, as one Syrian woman also states, also have massive graveyards of their lost ones in these districts and are here to stay close to them. The refugees are also concerned that their dislocation to Nizip will be the beginning of a process of their repatriation. Lastly, like Nurdağı, Islahiye is a majority Kurdish district. Historically, also being a marsh area, the land was dried up in the 1950s to be open to agricultural production. And the fragility of the ground for potential earthquakes have been reported even in official documents. But the logic of construction-led growth model of AKP is facilitated in the region by the new zoning plans implemented in the 2000s, opening the district to construction of high-rises. Many Kurds who started owning apartments from buildings constructed over the last 10 years are now left without houses, but debts they borrowed to become homeowners. Overall, as in Hatay and Maraş, the residential areas built over the last 10 years under the scope of the shifts in urban planning in line with the AKP's construction-led growth model were hit the hardest in Antep. The damage overnight left lower middle classes homeless but indebted, in contrast to their social and residential mobility aspirations. Others, refugees and poorer ethno-racial minorities who never had access to newly emerging residential areas are today denied even the earthquake victim status. Forced either into their moderately or severely damaged houses and or tents without even access to pretty limited services provided in temporary sheltering areas, they're waiting, concerned about next potential displacement for natural or political causes. Thank you.
Thank you, Hazal. Thank you so much. Our next speaker is Hişyar Özsoy. Anytime you would like, Hişyar. your mute. Thank you.
I am okay. So now you hear me? Okay. Thank you, dear Ipek and dear Anoush and all other friends who made this possible. It is very, as I'm listening to the presentations, I'm really learning new stuff. I was there helping the relief efforts and thinking through all of these questions. But I think I would like to raise 3 points that may help to frame the discussion a little bit so we can have a better discussion in the Q&A session. I totally agree with Eray, who said that this is not just a simple story of neoliberal accumulation of wealth through some construction sector. I mean, this is too simplistic. Everybody is now talking about the growth model in Turkey. Yes, that is true. The construction sector being kind of the backbone of this, that is true. Yeah, definitely. And let me tell you that the share of construction economy in Turkey has doubled in the last 20 years, from around 5% to 10%, while globally speaking, there is a decrease from 6 point something to 5.5%. So while there is a decrease in general, I mean, worldwide, the construction sector in Turkey doubled its share. And the reason for this, when you look really closely into the functioning of the sector, is that profit margins are very, very high. Sometimes 100%, sometimes 200%. I mean, you can't make this much money in any of those sectors. I mean, in tourism, in health sector, in services. And the reason for this is a non-enforcement of construction codes. And it's very simple. I mean, it's either we have lax construction codes or there is a lot of corruption and bribery. But these are not like individual bad things that some people do. I mean, this is very systemic. In order to make the construction economy as the backbone of Turkish economy, you need not to enforce the construction codes. Why? Because if you enforce the construction codes, it will not be that profitable. Probably profit margins will decrease to 20%. Who's going to do construction anyways under those circumstances? So that is why I think it is very, very important to see how systemic, how political this whole process is. I mean, it is a business model based on construction, but this construction sector is based on specific phenomena. And the main one is, of course, zoning amnesties that we have from time to time, through which illegal, unlawful, unsafe buildings become legalized in Turkey every couple of years. The last one was in 2018. And then the government is promoting a very strange economy through which actually people are accumulating wealth. So now I know everybody is trying to put the blame on the construction sector, but it's not just some contractors and some local governments and some state officials. Everybody is actually a part of this. This is how most people in Turkey, they accumulate wealth, ordinary citizens included. So it's a much bigger systemic issue there. But we have to think, I think that's what Dr. Çaylı was trying to say. We have to think about this neoliberal accumulation of wealth through a highly unregulated construction sector in line with histories of state and nation making in Turkey, histories of violence, of genocide, of displacement and dispossession. When you look actually to these territories from Hatay all the way to Maraş, up to Diyarbakır, actually you see all of these people are differently experiencing the earthquake even because of their histories of violence. I mean, historically speaking, for example, I was in Pazarcık. Pazarcık is a Kurdish Alevi place, and Elbistan too. And Maraş is the site of a pogrom against Kurdish Alevi people, like before 1980 military coup. And when you walk the streets of Pazarcık, you don't see any young people actually there. Very interesting. Mostly old, elderly people there. because almost every family has a couple of people in Europe. They are all living in diaspora. And all of them, they were trying to find their ways to come back to do Pazarcık, and most of the help came actually from Alevi Kurdish organizations in Europe, particularly in Germany. And at one point, after 10 days, the governor and some police officers and some security personnel, they came just to confiscate all of the humanitarian aid and other things, and threatened to actually arrest people, kick many volunteers out of the town. And so that was just one example I saw, but we need to really see how the narrative of neoliberal capital accumulation and more like local histories of state making and violence and displacement, how they actually interact with each other. The state was not in the two questions that you sent to us. I tried to think through those two questions. The first one was, I would say, a very interesting one, that the state was not there, it was absent. So that is the main discourse, like, where is the state, right? This is the question everybody was asking, like, throughout the earthquake areas. The state was there through its absence, I would say. And we have once again seen the destructive nature of the Turkish state apparatus, I would say. And this time, not through killing, not through military mobilization, not through F-16s, but this time through its absence mainly. At the time when people needed actual state institutions the most, even the Turkish army, everybody was expecting the Turkish army to do rescue efforts, and nobody was there, at least for the first 3 days. And once again, we saw why I'm saying the destructive capacity and nature of the Turkish state apparatus is that, I mean, if you actually want to mobilize, say, 1,000 soldiers against some Kurdish militants across Syria, I mean, you can do that in 24 hours. It's so easy. If you want to mobilize Turkish, police and army against some protesting Kurdish people in the streets of Diyarbakir, or Antep, or Adana, or even Hatay, doesn't matter. I mean, this is very, very easy to mobilize that in a state of national security. I mean, it's very easy. But we have seen, actually, while very skillful at destroying and killing, I would say, the state apparatus proved to be quite ineffective and dysfunctional in saving lives. I think we need to very, very seriously think about this. And this is not just rhetoric. I will give you just one example, and then I will finish with some concluding remarks. The rescue missions who came from like other countries, almost all of them, they had their thermal cameras. They had equipment, thermal cameras. And they were able to locate people and save them. But the Turkish rescue teams, many of them, they didn't have the thermal cameras. And that was something very striking to me. As I was thinking, I said, where do we see the thermal cameras actually? We see them in what they call SİHA and İHA. I don't know how to interpret them in English. What is SİHA and İHA? Anybody can help me there? These unmanned gunned machines, right? What they call them? SİHA. Drones, right? Yeah. Drones, they do have like all kinds of equipment to locate people and to kill. In fact, it's very interesting that actually that technology to kill people, most of the Kurdish militants across the border, that technology could have been easily used actually to save a lot of people from under the rubble. But that technology was not available to those people who came for rescue missions. So I was thinking again, I mean, the Turkish state is a very centralized one, very powerful actually when it comes to like the capacity of destruction is so big. And then we see this gigantic state apparatus, which is so powerful, which has like F-16s, they are proud of. You would remember, I mean, over the last 5-6 years, they are always talking about the military might of the Turkish Republic and our army, our F-16s, our drones, our like this, that. But then we have the earthquake. We can't even find a thermal camera to locate people. And I think this is a very, very serious question. We need to think. I mean, what is really state? What the state? I mean, how the state presents itself to us in such situations? What are the images of the state that are coming out of this? The last point. I mean, I talked very briefly about capital formation and the construction business model, and then the state apparatus, the centralized state apparatus, which is so ineffective in saving people, rescuing people, but very powerful actually in destroying lives and communities. And the last point is about, yes, we didn't have much state, presence on the ground in the first few days, and that was very costly. But something we saw was, I would say, almost miraculous. I mean, immense solidarity of people from everywhere. I mean, from all parts of Turkey, all parts of the world, everybody was mobilized. I mean, and that was something very interesting, and it was very scary for those who are in power too. In fact, a couple of days later, the state institutions, after the first shock, they tried to obstruct actually this humanitarian aid efforts, people mobilizing, volunteers. I think in the face of a highly centralized and ineffective and dysfunctional and oppressive and repressive state apparatus, what came to the rescue of people was actually that kind of solidarity. And I think that solidarity, we need to really think through this, because I know that in Syria as well, the situation is of course different. There is no state apparatus there. There are all kinds of organizations. So there too in Syria too, a lot of civilian initiatives like, ordinary people, volunteers, they came together to rescue people, to organize, to help those people. So I think that kind of state solidarity, that kind of social solidarity, and given that the state apparatus and the government, they are so scared of that kind of solidarity, it may be kind of a way out of this whole situation, both politically and also like thinking about it. So we need to really theorize. We need to attend to that solidarity, see how it is being formed, how it is people are mobilizing their resources. And this is not just fighting the earthquake, I would say. I mean, it may be also the gate to a better future in Turkey, a democratic future in Turkey. Let me stop here. I already talked too much, but in the Q&A session, we can unpack some of these issues. Thank you.
Thank you. You didn't talk too much. In fact, thanks so much. Our next speaker is Dr. Murat Güney. Murat.
Hi, thank you. Thank you for the organizers for bringing us together. Thank you for participants for listening to us, and thank you for all other speakers for their great presentations. So many important issues were already told. We, I guess, all agree that this disaster is political, and there is one question about how the government party AKP tries to represent this disaster. They call that disaster as a disaster of the century, so as if this is kind of an exceptional event. And people answered saying that actually the disaster of the century is the AKP government. So that was already mentioned, but I want to repeat, especially the 1999 Marmara earthquake and all the laws and regulations introduced after that earthquake was used by the AKP government as an opportunity, as mentioned before, like to suppress minorities and to impose state power. But also it is also used to segregate like poor populations. So the economic, I want to a little bit emphasize, focus more on the economic aspect of that. So, by the way, like Hişyar already mentioned, like the proportion of the construction industry to Turkey's overall economic production has increased gradually, like from 5% to 10%. But if you also add real estate sector and other related industries to construction, like about 1/3 of Turkish economy currently is based on construction and construction related sectors. So it's a huge amount, and this is a huge industry also based on land and housing price speculation. So this this is a very actually unfortunate thing, but like the Marmara earthquake, unfortunately, like provided the government like enormous power rights through like laws such as the disaster law number like 36306, like enormous rights to expropriate land, and that law is used like first of all to create more valuable land, to create luxury residences on valuable lands, and also to suppress economically and socially disadvantaged populations' resistance to unfair conditions of urban transformation. So recently there is a debate in Turkey, like in order to, like the government stigmatized people who previously resisted urban transformation projects because of unfair conditions. I can give you like 2 examples. I am more familiar on issues in that took place in Istanbul. Like the disaster law was introduced in 2012, and at the time there was an ongoing urban transformation project in Fikirtepe in Kadıköy region of Istanbul, where land value is high. This is not an earthquake priority risk zone. However, because it's close to the socio-economically like high neighborhood Kadıköy, so it was selected as an urban transformation pilot project. Some residents who didn't trust in contractors didn't want to sign deals. So just 1 year after the introduction of the disaster law in 2013, Fikirtepe was introduced as a disaster risk zone, just to suppress people's oppositions. Same thing happened in Tozkoparan, in Güngören, again in Kadıköy. People came together, they formed a neighborhood solidarity organization. They resisted the unfair conditions of urban transformation. And again, in 2013, right after the introduction of the law, Tozkoparan was again declared as a disaster risk zone. People went to the court, canceled that decision. What happened? Again, an amendment, as Eray Çaylı mentioned, like there are amendments just to reimpose that law, to to make the government more powerful. Depending on an amendment, Tozkoparan was again renamed as a risk zone. So this is how the disaster, how that this law was abused to suppress opposition. Another important thing is that the government, Hişyar mentioned that the government can be present through its absence. Yes, the government also this. I want to apply that also to the economic way how they use it. For instance, what will happen in Istanbul when a major earthquake takes place? We know that poor neighborhoods are untouched. There was no urban improvement project there. So all these projects were absent. This law was only used like areas like Kadıköy to create urban rent. So you demolish old buildings, you build new renovated buildings and sell them for a double price. But the most risky areas in Istanbul are untouched. So the government also kill people by letting them die, right? So if you are poor, you don't deserve any urban improvement. This is also, again, how the law is used. So we, again, as all agree, all disasters are like this last one, are the result of such political and economic decisions. And last point, this is something I always repeat and emphasize. Again, there were ways to save people's lives. There are still options you can implement immediately, and even not taking that decision is results in killing people. Like in Turkey, also in Istanbul, there are so many vacant buildings. Still there are many vacant buildings, and still there are people who are trying to find a shelter after the earthquake. But you cannot match them, right? The government could take these vacant apartments, could convert them to affordable rentals, could provide shelter, but no, these decisions are not taken. So thank you. So we can continue maybe in the question and answer section.
Thank you, Murat, so much. And before I turn it over to Anoush and Ekin, I just want to take a moment again to thank you, all of you, for your time, for your expertise. And these were just exceptional presentations. And I think it is quite clear that questions of justice and equity should be at the center of any kind of analysis that comes after this. And it's not only in Turkey, in the US too, like after disasters, there's this, kind of anodyne call for, solidarity, we're all on the same boat, that kind of thing. And people are not on the same boat. Some people don't have a boat. They can't even climb into the boat. And if they try to, they're, thrown off. I don't know if people in the audience remember George W. Bush looking down at New Orleans, from the plane, not bothering to go there, and people, refusing to get into helicopters, rescue helicopters, because they could not trust the state. They could not trust that they would be, immediately after being rescued, somebody would send them a bill for their rescue. So yes, I mean, this is not something that people experience. Natural disaster is not the same in the way it is experienced by people. And it is clear that this particular earthquake, I really appreciated also that you guys brought in the historical and social background to this. This is what we see here is not only, the seismic fault lines, these are also the fault lines of Turkey, the historical, the political, and the social fault lines of Turkey. I think that wasn't starkly in front of us. Anyhow, I won't take any more of your time. I'm just going to turn it over to Anoush and then to Ekin.
Ekin, do you want to start with your question?
Yes. Okay, Anoush, thanks, İpek, and I echo İpek in giving you my immense gratitude for such insightful opening remarks, coming from very different perspectives as well as building on each other. So I wanted to open up the discussion by asking you to talk more about the interplay between state's absence and presence. I know that some of the speakers, especially Hişyar and then Murat, has mentioned the topic very eloquently, very powerfully, but maybe we can talk even more on this all together. And specifically, I'm wondering, what do you think about the many ways in which the state has been present in the earthquake hit region in the immediate aftermath of the disaster? And today, nowadays, we are now in the first month after the earthquake, and still the state's absence is very present in terms of lack of providing very basic support for life, water, shelter, so on and so forth. But we are also seeing some other means through which the state has been maybe present, through maybe the oppression on the solidarity movements and initiatives, through politicians' performative presence in the earthquake hit region, through laws and amendments. So through basically very material, practical, discursive and performative ways, we continue seeing the political regimes' presence in the region shaping the politics of disaster. So I want to hear more how you see this political regime's presence and what characterizes it in your perspective, and how it shapes the very everyday current life in the earthquake hit region, and as well as beyond, bearing in mind that some of the laws and emergency laws has been put into place to not only affect the region itself, but also overall the national space as well. Just a reminder that, for example, the environmental impact assessment requirements has been amended, has been put into weight. It is just not in order at the moment, in place at the moment for 3 months across the nation, across the country. So yeah, just overall your remarks and ideas about what characterizes the political regime's presence in the aftermath of the disaster. And we can just go in order you would like to. Anyone who wants to address can just jump in, I would say.
Anoush, will you?
Shall I ask my question as well?
Yeah, let's.
I'll ask my question too.
So
Then
we have, so that we have them both, and then yeah.
Yeah. So just to start off, I'd like to echo İpek and Ekin's words to thank you all so much for sharing your valuable contributions and reflections with us today. So far, this discussion has been extremely informative and also very chilling as we think through the broader politics of disaster in the case of this earthquake, as well as the long histories of violence that have created the foundation for this most recent destruction of lives and communities. So my question for the panel is the following. Long before the earthquake, the AKP government tightened its control on national media sources, and this censorship continues, including on social media. So I would like to hear you all reflect about how the government has attempted to control the narrative about the earthquake in both national and international media, and how have local and opposition actors attempted to bypass official regimes of censorship. And also, considering and perhaps despite such censorship, how is this catastrophe changing people's perceptions of the AKP, both in the affected area and around the country? And also, what short-term and long-term effects might the aftermath of the earthquake have in terms of political outcomes locally and nationally? So thank you all again so much. I'd look forward to hearing your reflections about both of these questions.
Would
Are
you
we
like to
following
go in the order of the panel, or if anybody would like to just jump in and start talking, that's fine too. You know, we won't cut you off if you want to talk.
I think Hazal was starting to address.
I mean, I was asking
Go
if
ahead,
we are
Hazal.
following the order. It's
Go ahead, please. Go ahead, please. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, about the first question, because it has been like one of the main questions that I have been like grappling myself, like not seeing the state, but at the same time feeling so much around. So I believe we all around the region come together in our indignation toward the state authorities for their failure in providing rescue and relief efforts, abandoning the earthquake victims to their fate. But at the same time, I feel, however, like this undeniable absence of the state on the ground is strangely accompanied by its presence. And by presence, I'm also referring to the direct outcomes of the policies implemented over 10 plus years. I mean, it feels kind of weird to be able to make this kind of a comparison, but I was also at the epicenter of the 1999 earthquake as a 9-year-old child. I remember back then receiving in the third day after the earthquake, our Kızılay provided tent. This did not happen this time. Even the rescue efforts did not reach many places by the third day. Like we have been talking a lot about this, but what I also remember from the 1999 earthquake are the number of individuals and civil society organizations running around and providing help in a really coordinated manner. We see today similar initiatives, of course, like there is a really significant solidarity, and we see such initiatives, particularly in Antakya, for instance, or the help organized and provided from Diyarbakır to Adıyaman. But in Antep, for instance, a coordination among the unions, local NGOs, chambers of different professions, and oppositional political parties could still not be established. I mean, I refer by a coordination here to a simple one, at least to keep these different groups in touch and aware of each other's actions and efforts concerning the earthquake. And there have been such calls from like various political parties and also human rights associations, for instance, inviting local organizations to a collective initiative. But the years of criminalization by state authorities of various institutions proved to be enough, I think, for making different organizations hesitant in participating in new formations, new political formations. Notwithstanding the incredible solidarity of different organizations in different places, I mean, also including Hatay, Adıyaman, and Diyarbakır, except Diyarbakır though, there's, I guess, like a better coordination going on there. But I also hear from the friends volunteering concerns over this lack of coordination. And I do not think this can really be taught independent of the policies that undercut the political culture of the opposition over the years. Plus, even the concerns over the criminalization today, with like emergency law declared, like declaring the zone of like a state of emergency, is so deep that almost every institution tries to do something remaining as invisible as possible to the state authorities. Like no one carries their banners, trying to remain as silent as possible. This being said, like at this current moment, I kind of doubt actually the state authorities can really prevent such local organizations to operate on the ground. I mean, it did, like the state authorities did start pretty assertive, like trying to, I mean, there have been instances of truck drivers carrying goods coming to the region being arrested, or opening warehouses of political parties or local NGOs for police investigation. But the problems are pretty abundant, and I feel like for the moment, at least in Antep, like the state officials like hardly seem to be on top of things, like in terms of like this criminalization efforts. But the years of oppression and criminalization have effects so deep that turns inaction into best risk-free strategy for many until a rather more structural political change takes place. And in this lack of mobilization, inaction, suspicion toward each other, I see the state's presence that shaped our political culture over 10 plus years. And of course, another form of presence of the state is the official visits, reinforcing the out of sight, out of mind kind of a logic of disaster management. And because this logic, of course, is not only harmful in a discursive level, but shape how the authorities manage the population in the temporary sheltering areas and also beyond. A week ago, for instance, some residents of state-provided tents are relocated to containers in Nurdağı. And the area was ornamented by trees brought from outside the city before the visit of the president. A square is designed almost like a carnival area with even a zoo installed next to the Quran courses. And I don't know how, take Yürek middle schools. I don't know how to find the exact word for this in English. But then, of course, who were left outside of this carnival area were the Syrian refugees, Roma and Dom population, and also further Kurdish residents of the region. Instead, their tents were removed and dislocated to an area that is further away from the site of official visits. The limited services provided for children, women, elderly in the container area do not reach the tents of those people, and whose tents are, by the way, right by the waste of the developing container city and excavation vehicles. And of course, all the officials visiting Antep are taken to the square as their sole address. And it's a place actually where the statehood is staged or performed. But actually we see, I guess, the actual presence of the state in the areas left beyond this carnival-like looking square they just created.
Yeah, maybe I could go next. Although I think the question of state's absence versus its presence has been really has been addressed really thoroughly. Again, maybe to just reiterate, it's never really, I think, wholly absent or wholly present, but it's the velocity and the kind of visibility of its presence changes maybe, but I think it's sometimes passively violent and sometimes actively violent. Maybe we could put it that way. One example from the get-go was, the kind of so-called reduction of the bandwidth, the limitations to the internet, which actually cost lives. There's nothing much more present than that. And also part of this question really requires us to kind of maybe, again, expand on how we understand the state, because there's a whole set of actors that may not hold office, etc., but they are actually obviously arm's length organizations, so to speak, or they're affiliated with the state. People staging mass prayers when there are still people under the rubble, these kind of things. These kind of so-called civilian social actors, which again are completely aligned with the government, and instead of rescuing people, they prioritize these prayers, etc. So this kind of, I think this is also part of that presence. Maybe also to bring in, because I fear also that we might put, obviously the AKP, Erdogan, etc., these factors are to be prioritized in our critique, but again, we shouldn't lose sight of the deeper dynamics and the more systemic dynamics, which actually includes institutional politics in general, mainstream opposition as well. And maybe this relates to the second question too, in terms of controlling the narrative. We should, I think about how this narrative is controlled not only through overt censorship, but also through what is permitted. And you see here that emphases on, for instance, meritocracy are pretty much, permitted to proliferate, which are completely unhelpful, in my opinion. And this kind of, the question of what is permitted to be said in terms of a kind of critique that is permitted. The idea that the reason why what's happened has happened is because, of the AKP only, or Erdogan, or Erdoganism, as Kılıçdaroğlu recently put it, because they're unmeritocratic, because there's no respect for science. I find these are unhelpful emphases, but they are permitted. So I think we have to think about this and how they are actually allowed to proliferate. And geologists, seismologists are kind of given center stage, and yet not really the kind of social political critics that actually we really desperately need at this time, rendering the science of seismology and geology as something of a kind of something about destiny, as it were, that is beyond our control, right? So again, I think these kind of narratives are permitted, and we have to think about what is permitted to be said, as well as what is obviously what is also censored.
Maybe I can also add a couple of comments to this. You hear me, right? And okay,
we hear you well.
Okay. So
yes, we hear you.
I think one interesting way the state, of course, showed itself was through declaring the emergency rule. In fact, President Erdogan didn't talk for quite some time, more than a day at all. And then when he started talking, he was so angry at people. And he declared emergency rule in 10 provinces. And of course, I mean, this turned into kind of a national security issue to manage, right? Rather than rescue efforts, humanitarian aid, but it's a national security issue, first thing. Although, of course, I mean, in such a situation, emergency rule is normal to declare. As a person who is highly critical of any kind of emergency rule, I'm saying this, because this is like 10 cities, immense destruction, devastation, death. I mean, it may be, but we suspect, and we already have signs, that the government will use emergency rule as an opportunity before the coming elections against the opposition. That is one thing, and we see. The second way, of course, the government needs to give people some hope and some promise, and they have already started making contracts, and people are still trying to find their dead under the rubble, all those collapsed buildings. Even the but they have already started that. Why? Because they need to create at least the image that things are going to improve, that these houses are going to be built, and it's part of kind of an effort to create the hope that things are going to get better. It's not that possible. They are talking about 600,000 houses to be built in 1 year. 3 years ago, we had another earthquake in Elazığ province, and they promised to build 25,000 houses still. I mean, people are waiting for that, and Turkey doesn't have any money. We don't have resources, really. But that is kind of, as we get closer to the elections, we only have 2 months now. Of course, the whole occupation of the government is to make sure that they manage this process in a way, control the image and the narrative. I mean, they can't actually repair the damage. I mean, they don't have the time and they don't have the resources, right? But you hear me, right? Okay, but
Yes.
but they are really desperately trying to control the perception and the narrative of the earthquake. I mean, of course, I mean, still it is 1 month after the earthquake. Still, I mean, the problems like tents, people don't have tents. Drinking water is still a problem in a place like Hatay, for example. a lot of civil society organizations, political parties, local municipalities, they are trying their best to actually help. And I agree with Hazal in that I mean, initially they tried to control all of the space of humanitarian aid, but it's so big and they are so ineffective and they just couldn't. And then for now, they are letting people do it. But we actually communicated with the Ministry of Interior when they actually confiscated our, the aid we gathered at Pazarcık together with a lot of Kurdish Alevi institutions. They said that, I mean, the moment we gain some sense of control, we are going to confiscate everything. I mean, we won't let anybody do anything. And this is us, we are going to do it. So, and they want to centralize everything in the hands of Afad and also Kızılay, but nobody trusts these two institutions, right? So that is the big problem. And that is why it is true that people are still trying to, I mean, when even trying to help fellow human beings there, you are hiding from the state apparatus. It is a very strange, awkward situation, really. And this earthquake, in that sense, it's not just an earthquake, a natural kind of seismic activity that killed people. It also created a landscape where we are actually negotiating what the state is, who we are to each other, what is social solidarity, Kurds, Alevi people, Arab people, the refugees. So all of this kind of, I mean, all of these fault lines of the society are out wide in the open now, and we are trying to actually renegotiate in political terms, in social terms. We are trying to renegotiate this. One other thing is, of course, about the question that Anoush asked about the political implications of this whole process. I know many people kind of try to draw an analogy between what happened in Istanbul, 1999, and then now another earthquake. You know, the collapse of the government in 1999. I mean, the Ecevit and Anavatan and MHP, I mean, they couldn't recover after the earthquake in 1999 in the Marmara area. And so the key question that people keep asking is whether we will have a similar kind of scenario in this case, a huge earthquake, a big financial and economic crisis we have, and can this be the end of President Erdogan's rule or the presidential system he has created? I would say, I mean, interestingly, we haven't seen such a significant shift in voting behavior. At least the recent polls are not really showing a very significant shift. People are angry, people are scared, people, talk, but when it comes to actual voting behavior, we just probably will need to wait the elections to see what's going to happen there, really. And part of the reason is, honestly, and I say this and I'll stop there, I mean, the political opposition has been waiting for the government to get weaker and weaker to the point that they can win. You see what I mean? So there was the earthquake, there was the economic crisis, and then came the pandemic, and then we have a big financial crisis, and then now we have the earthquake, and finally, some perception is that, oh, now Erdogan is weak actually, and then, the opposition is going to win. And I think, I mean, rather than kind of building and proposing an alternative to, this whole presidential system, the whole disaster system that Erdogan created, we are waiting for the government to get weaker and weaker and weaker to the point like below a certain limit, and then there is a chance of the opposition to win. That is a very interesting, I would say, position, and very counterproductive, I would say, too. But it is sad to say that President Erdogan, I mean, has a lot of resources, as Anoush asked in the question. I mean, he owns the media, he controls means of building narratives, circulating those narratives. Murat said, I mean, already, I mean, this has been dubbed as a disaster of the century, very exceptional situation. It's already too big. What we can do, nobody can actually deal with a disaster of this kind of magnitude. So these are all kind of narratives they're producing and circulating, and whether we like it or not, there are some buyers to these narratives as well, I should say. So that is why I think, going back to the issue of social solidarity that I mentioned, or self-government, actually, the communities organizing, self-organization, communities self-organizing in times of crisis. And also, as we get closer to the elections, let me say as a politician this as well, I mean, it's not just an earthquake disaster we are having. We are having a huge, I mean, the whole country is in a disaster situation. Political disasters, economic disasters, education system is in a disastrous situation, the health system is in a disaster. I think, I mean, disaster can be kind of used as a metaphor to talk about the general situation of the country. We are living in a disaster. I mean, this earthquake is just a part of it. And that is why I think we need to think more seriously when building our narratives. I mean, what kind of narratives do we need really to get out of this disastrous situation? Not just narratives about the earthquake, but political narratives as well about the state, about a possible future. So we are getting closer to these elections. We have only 2 months here. And let's hope that, I mean, we are able to build narratives as opposed to those who are being produced and circulated by the government. But I should say that so far, in general, I would say that the opposition has not been really that successful. Even if under these circumstances, President Erdogan is still kind of one of the favorite candidates. I mean, it's a very sad situation, I should say. And this is partly because of the inability of the opposition actually to kind of provide the kind of narratives that we need.
Yeah. So I may continue. Yes, yeah, maybe some points, at some points I repeat things that were already told, but actually, like in brief, the government is doing and repeating what they know best. So like, it's like the same story is repeating, I think, like, so the state is present both actively and also through its absence. So how people feel in other parts of the Turkey. So the disaster make people in other parts of Turkey to feel insecure. So people know that like when another major earthquake happens, they will left alone and should act on their own. So for instance, like I hear like from some friends, some residents of Istanbul, those who can afford it and those who has the means, decide to move into secure towns and cities or to neighborhoods in north of Istanbul, which is away from the fault line. So of course, that group is a small minority. People who have not enough money to transform their own buildings still has to stay in their homes that are not resistant to earthquakes. On the other hand, hundreds of thousands of people from earthquake hit cities move into major cities like Ankara, Izmir, Istanbul, where is more opportunity for employment. So we still didn't feel that, or we need to work more on that issue, but we are experiencing a major internal migration. So many people will stay where they move in. So and this of course creates housing and land price speculation. So like we know in Mersin, for example, like rents prices doubled. In Istanbul, like there, I clearly observed like 50% rent increase in certain neighborhoods in just 1 month. So actually, this is what the government already encouraged, like land and housing price speculation. So this is what they already do for years. So you are on your own if there is a disaster, and you are on your own if you need to find like a safe housing. And the other point is, like, again, they are doing what they know best, and they are doing that also actively. This is like also a point Hişyar mentioned, like they are constructing. They introduce new housing construction projects in earthquake hit areas. They are very present with TOKİ and with concrete projects. So, they asked for 1 more year, right? So they asked for 1 more year for completing all those construction. So I think that that promise also includes a kind of blackmail. So the government implied that if you do not vote for us, your apartments will not be completed and you cannot afford housing if the opposition parties come to power and interest rates, for instance, increase rapidly. So I say that because this is a tactic they already used in other public housing projects of TOKİ. So they make people indebted, so people start buying and they are indebted, and they were told that, like, you need to keep voting for us so that you can pay your debt. Otherwise, interest rates will increase, or you cannot trust in other parties. They may not complete the houses. So they are, in that sense, very actively present also, the state, and so they use these public housing projects, I think, as a binding force for re-election as well. And I agree also with Hişyar that, like, the government, either through blackmail or by other means, they have, like, the AKP government has, like, still many hardcore supporters. And to challenge that, like, the opposition also should introduce, like, concrete projects about how to protect us from earthquakes, right? And that projects should be not based on increasing profit and rent, but these projects should show us that they really, truly care to protect our lives, right? So we need that. So we need, like, concrete economic and political projects introduced by the opposition as well, like, and so that we can hope for a better future and not the repetition of the same disasters over and over again. Thanks.
Okay, now we are, I guess, opening it to audience questions. And we have one question already raised in the chat box. I would like to read it. It's a little long, but I try to shorten it. So it comes from Nejat Dinç, and he says, I want to draw attention to the expected and executed role of Kızılay, which is the Red Crescent in Turkey, on the disaster relief efforts. It appears like there's a strong discrepancy between what people historically have expected from Kızılay to fulfill versus how Kızılay operated on the ground, such as Kızılay sold tents to one of the NGOs in Turkey, rather than providing tents for free as part of the relief efforts. So, however, he says what Kızılay did throughout the relief efforts with its business model, which is neoliberally organized and modeled after for-profit corporations. And this model is what people have learned to demand from the governments for the past 4 decades, starting from the days of Turgut Özal. So in other words, ironically and paradoxically, we are faced with a public who eagerly asked for a specific policy for decades, neoliberal policies, while simultaneously rejecting the outcomes of this policy in an equally eager manner, people refusing and rejecting this outcome of neoliberal policy. So having said that, the question is twofold. One, how would you comment on the triangular relation between neoliberalized state institutions, specific practices of Kızılay, and the contradictory expectations of the public at large? And to what extent what we experienced through Kızılay is the crystallization of the end of neoliberal experimentation and ideology?
Yeah, can I say something here?
Sure, please.
I mean, we live in a country where our president actually has several times said he wanted to rule the country as a CEO. This is what President Erdogan said. I mean, the country is a family company somehow. And of course, if President Erdogan wants to run the country as a CEO, and the country being a company for profit maximization, it is only normal that the Kızılay is selling human blood and tents and, all kinds of things that people donated for help. Definitely, I mean, and this is not the only, I would say, problem we are having with the Kızılay. Previously, Kızılay also donated huge sums of money to this organization led by President Erdogan's son, Turgev, right? About I think some $7-8 billion. And so, and when you look actually also at the, I mean, these are supposed to be nonprofit, right? This is the nonprofit sector. But in Turkey, it is kind of almost a tradition to talk about high salaries of members of parliament, right? We know that. But actually, his salary probably is twice, maybe 4 times more than the salary of a parliamentarian. You see what I mean? I mean, this is a big business sector now. I mean, Kızılay, unfortunately. And of course, people, even when we were small kids, I remember, I mean, Kızılay was the thing that people would donate blood. I mean, that is a place where you somehow accumulate things where, and you, so that you can use them in times of need, right? I think now nobody trusts Kızılay and AFA too. Even pro-government people, they don't trust these institutions. They know how these things are functioning. So of course, I mean, I wish these were, I mean, I don't know how to put this in order to prevent any misinterpretation, but I mean, this is not even neoliberalism, you see. I mean, they need to be functioning a little bit. This is not, even if it is neoliberalism, it is a very, very bad form of neoliberalism, right? So, I mean, they don't function. Simply just, they don't function. It's just buying and selling doesn't mean that you do have a neoliberal functioning of these institutions. At least partly, I mean, ideally speaking, on the paper, they should be transparent. They should be at least, so that we can, scrutinize, I mean, who is having this money, how these resources are being gathered, and, some supervision or accountability. I mean, there is nothing about these processes when it comes to institutions like AFAD and Kızılay. I mean, this is mostly, I would say, hollowed out institutions that are totally dysfunctional in times of crisis. A lot of people close to the government, they are being appointed to these places. Imagine a person studying theology is being appointed to AFAD, which is a disaster management, disaster relief kind of institution. I mean, why do you appoint religious people to these places? I mean, you can appoint them to other places, but so in that sense, so I wouldn't even say this is a kind of, it's not the kind of neoliberalized nonprofit sector in, say, Western Europe, for example. This is something different, and we need to really understand the space between nonprofit and profit, state, and how all of this, they interact with each other. It requires a more kind of nuanced understanding, I would say, rather than a simple kind of homogeneous kind of narrative of neoliberal capitalism unfolding in Turkey.
I just want to say we just have a couple of minutes left. So I welcome others to comment on that question. We also have one more question from a Syrian American human rights lawyer who put a link in the chat about resources for support. And that person had a question concerning rebuilding efforts, and given the systemic corruption, how do we ensure that zoning codes are abided by moving forward? And then after that, perhaps you all could just offer, if you have any brief concluding questions, and then we'll slowly wrap up.
I just wanted to, if I can, add a brief kind of note to what has already been said in terms of this Kurulay question. I think we shouldn't lose sight of how, I would maybe dispute this idea that people demanded, or I mean, I know I'm aware the question says learn to demand, and at least we could qualify that verb learn. That was very violent, and the coup, but not just that, but also war in Kurdistan, crackdown on neighborhoods in the late 80s who actually had managed to somewhat recover from the coup, to self-organize, crack down on those neighborhoods. All of these things are actually related in terms of how people learn to demand neoliberalism. It's a very violent process. So it's not just people wake up and suddenly demand Kurulay to be run like a company. And I think in relation to that, we should look at how this whole crisis unfolded, because we should look at how and why this organization called Ahbap appears. And again, I have nothing against Ahbap, obviously. The people who, the volunteers, etc., they are perhaps great, amazing people and well-intentioned, etc. But my question is always in these situations, why do people suddenly want to donate to an organization that highlights how neutral it is, how it has no politics? Whereas for me, we should very much actually do the opposite. We should donate to organizations who are already existing, who have a long history behind them, who have a firm social basis, who have a certain political stance in the sense of standing against just injustice and struggling for justice. So we should really think carefully about how people are sold this idea that donations should be apolitical, that there's this idea of neutrality. And then time and again, we wake up and suddenly, again, much of this has nothing to do, again, I'd like to stress, nothing to do with the actual people who run Ahbap. But in the case of Akut, for instance, the resources get confiscated. That's the best case scenario. Worst case scenario is it gets hijacked from inside, etc. So I'm always wondering, and this is, I think, the question we should think about, how the whole years and decades of propaganda against Alevis, Kurds, socialists, people who managed to self-organize in their neighborhoods, then makes a huge chunk of the populace think that, yeah, we should donate not to these organizations, not to these activists, but to these ones because they are neutral, because they're political. And then they buy their tents from Kurulay, etc. So I think it's a kind of quite long-winded story, and we should really think about those details.
We have a few more minutes if any of you, Hazal or Murat, want to address any of those two questions, basically, raised from the audience.
I'm not really sure about to what extent the zoning codes will be abided moving forward, and I'm not really optimistic given how it has been so far, and also the codes will probably be altered over and over again, and this also is not necessarily just a problem about the current government. The mainstream opposition in that sense is also not really promising, and this history kind of keeps repeating itself in Turkey, in terms of this zoning codes and their rearrangements. But I was just on a really brief note, I didn't really have a chance to answer to Anoush's question, but everyone really gave really deep answers about also kind of pessimistic answers to the effect of the ongoing support towards the government. Also I agree with all those comments, and I personally also like feeling the anger in the air. I also have the like tendency to think like this earthquake will be the end of like this government's power right after the previous one that brought the government to the power. Like this kind of analogy is really popular nowadays, but at the same time, I really think this is not necessarily the case on the ground. One thing is that like while the anger is common and shared by many people, but one way the government's narrative managed to direct this anger partly to the nature by calling it the like disaster of the century, and like there like no single government could be ever to cover this kind of a disaster. And I think the recent developments coming from mainstream opposition also kind of gave this sign to many people, like this coalition bloc being like shaken, parties like withdrawing from the coalition, and then a new coalition discussion going on kind of gave people also the sign like there's no really like such a stable alternative in terms of at least mainstream politics. And also partly the anger is also being directed largely at the Syrian population as well, like at least in Antep, the like refugees are also being the like scapegoat of the like this crisis. So yeah, I will just stop on this note and thank you.
Murat, would you like to?
Yeah, as a last point, maybe I can say something about Kızılay. So I think, yeah, I agree with Hişyar that Kızılay maybe is not a good working, even neoliberal institution, but in terms of crystallization of experimentation, I think Kızılay is the crystallization of experimentation of the AKP rule. So like the level of corruption and it's working. And Kızılay also has a very symbolic power, like it's a 150 years old institution, and you even donate your blood to that institution, so your life, part of your life. And Kızılay also has the monopoly of receiving blood donation, so it's a huge symbolic power. So whether, and I think therefore it's like that was discussed a lot, and it was a big news and repeated over and over again. So whether this is the end of an ideology or end of that experimentation, we will see in the elections, I guess. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Murat. And thank you to all of our panelists. We are so grateful for all of you for joining us and sharing your extremely valuable expertise.
Anoush, before you close, can I just make one more announcement?
Yes.
The election calendar is out there now, and those people who can vote, who are citizens of Turkey, please check whether you are registered, because you may be removed from the registry by the government. And if you are not registered, please go and register. We don't have much time. It's only March 17. And I invite everybody just to go to the ballot and vote on May 14. I think that would be a very, very important turning point in the history of democracy in Turkey. Thank you.
Thank you, Hişyar, for that important note. Hopefully that will be an opportunity for some kind of positive change. So again, on behalf of the Keyman Modern Turkish Studies program, I thank all of our audience for joining us, and thank you to all of our panelists for joining us from all over the world in this virtual event and for sharing your expertise. We hope to see you all at future Keyman events. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much to everyone.